So yes, the Iranians are preparing themselves for the worst. They are preparing themselves for aggression. But the difference is that Iran is very, very powerful. It's been preparing itself for 2 decades. It has underground bases across the country. And especially over the past few months, the Iranians have been upgrading their missiles and drones and anti-aircraft capabilities and anti-missile capabilities so that when the time comes, or if the time comes, they will be able to hit very hard and very accurately.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, a professor of English literature and on Orientalism at the University of Tehran, an advisor to the Iranian nuclear negotiating team, or previously an advisor to it, and a prolific commentator here on YouTube and other platforms. Professor Marandi always offers important Iranian viewpoints as well as realist analysis, so I'm very happy he agreed to come online. Professor Marandi, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor.
Well, it's great talking to you because you've got some first-hand experience of what it is like to be connected with these Iranian with the talks, the negotiations with the United States. So, although, if I understand it correctly, you did so in the previous with these previous negotiations. Um, can you maybe update us first of all what's going on as we speak on this May 6th? 2025 in these negotiations, Donald Trump gave a 2 months deadline to come to an understanding and agreement. But at this point, after Trump himself exiting the JCPOA, what can we expect, or what does Iran expect from these negotiations?
That's a good question. I was a media advisor for the nuclear talks in 2015 that led to the JCPOA. And 3 years ago, when the talks were revived, I was also a media advisor. And on both occasions, I was in Vienna during the uh, period of the talks. Uh, the mechanism today is a bit different. They are not engaged in speaking with the media, and I'm not at all involved, of course, in the substance of the negotiations. What I can say in response to your question is that um, Iran has a very bad history with the United States, with or without Trump. The nuclear deal, which was signed, the JCPOA, was a deal where the Iranians immediately committed itself to its obligations, whereas Obama never did that. He violated the deal from day one, both the spirit of the deal, but also the substance of the deal uh, in general was violated by the United States. And for example, the Iranian central bank was never able to conduct any international transaction at all during the Obama tenure, during his presidency after the deal, among other things, among other violations of the deal. The expansion of the sanctions regime continued under Obama. And then when Trump came, of course, he ultimately tore up the deal. So Iran does not have a good past with the United States. And it's not just a nuclear deal. Literally on any issue that the Iranians and the Americans over the last 40 some years negotiated on and came to an agreement over, in every single instance, the United States violated its side of the bargain. That's just how they work. And so, as we speak, the two sides are holding indirect talks at the insistence of the Iranians. The Iranians, under Biden, their talks with the Americans were indirect, and they insist that model continues unless the United States changes its behavior, and unless we see real changes in the way in which the Americans deal with the Iranians. It will continue to be indirect. If at some point the Americans show goodwill and they show that they're pursuing a meaningful change in the relationship, then things could change. But so far, we don't see any sign of that. Now, Trump has said many different things to different people, and so have the people around him, and that causes a lot of confusion because Iran is not going to negotiate its allies. It's not going to negotiate its defense and offensive capabilities. Its conventional capabilities uh, they have to do with the Iranians and not with the Americans. It's not for them to make any comment on those issues or to make any decision on those issues. The Iranians will only negotiate the nuclear program, and what they will negotiate is a nuclear is will be within the framework of international law. In other words, Iran will not negotiate its sovereignty and its rights to have a peaceful nuclear program, which includes enrichment, nuclear enrichment. And so, if the United States wants to have assurances that Iran is not developing a nuclear weapon, that's doable. That's what the International Atomic Energy Agency is for anyway. That's one of its responsibilities. So that is something that can be solved. But of course, the problem is that we don't know exactly what the Americans are seeking because it changes sometimes every day. Sometimes in a single interview, Trump's latest interview, we saw him say almost two things simultaneously. On the one hand, he was saying Iran shouldn't have a nuclear program. That's not going to happen. On the other hand, he said, I can listen to the argument about Iran's nuclear program or its enrichment cycle. I didn't see the interview, so I'm not quite sure what he said. But the point is that he says different things at different times, and the people around him have also said different things. And it's not just Iran; it's Russia. He was going to end the war in one day, and now his honeymoon period of 100 days has passed, and we seem to be seeing the United States actually moving in the opposite direction. They're now giving arms to Ukraine, new arms to Ukraine under Trump, and it seems that this war is going to continue for uh, in the months ahead from what we're seeing. But during this 100-day period, we've seen all sorts of different things. Kellogg says one thing, others say something completely different. Kellogg sounds like he's the spokesman for the Biden team, whereas we were hearing more reasonable things from other people surrounding Trump, including Witkoff. But nothing, been no breakthrough. And now it seems like, as I said, things are moving in the wrong direction again. So the Iranians are looking at how the Americans are behaving over Ukraine. It doesn't look good. Iran has seen what the Americans have done in over Gaza. Again, Witkoff, we were told that he read the Riot Act and that he told Netanyahu to come on a Saturday to his office and to end this genocide. We had a ceasefire. We saw a ceasefire. Then soon afterwards, Trump started speaking about ethnic cleansing and expelling Palestinians from their land and taking it over. Very sinister thing to say, but that's what he was saying. But that was not only sinister, but it was against the agreement that he brokered. Witkoff brokered a deal, and Trump was the first person to literally reject the deal. And then, of course, he gave the green light to Netanyahu to restart the genocide. Before that, Netanyahu began the starvation siege, which continues as we speak, and people are beginning to die as a result of starvation. So his man put forward the deal. It was accepted. It was implemented. And then he tore it up, literally. Trump himself tore it up. So we have an instance where Trump himself was behind a deal. He tore it up in Gaza. And then we have another instance where he promised a deal. He promised to end the war, and he didn't. And now he seems to be shifting back to Biden's policies. So when we look at that, when we look at Ukraine, and then we put Gaza alongside that and the genocide in Gaza, it's unbelievable, really. 19 months of genocide in front of the eyes of the world, and they shamelessly continue it, and the Western media is silent about it, and Western elites are all looking away. Unbelievable. But in any case, when we look at these two cases, and then we see the inconsistencies in what Trump and others around Trump have been saying over the Iranian nuclear, uh, about putting a deal with Iran, it's impossible for us to figure out where things will go ultimately. And even if we do have a deal with Trump, let's say there's some sort of breakthrough, Witkoff comes, he accepts reality, they have a deal. It's obviously not going to be the JCPOA because Iran's uh, nuclear uh, advances, its peaceful nuclear program has advanced remarkably since back then. Any agreement will have to acknowledge Iran's technological advances because the United States has been imposing sanctions during these years. It's not going to give Iran compensation, so it has to acknowledge Iran's nuclear achievements. But let's say they go and Witkoff accepts that, the United States accepts a reasonable deal. What's to say, or who's to say that the next morning you suddenly wake up and Trump hasn't said something on Truth Socials, basically negating the whole deal? A week later, a month later, 2 months later, if he says suddenly, "I don't accept this deal. The Iranians are terrible people. They're liars. They're doing this. He can make up anything because he makes things up all the time. Who's to say that therefore a signed deal will last?" This is the problem that the Iranians have to deal with. And that's why senior Iranian officials are saying that the government, the administration, and all, and society has to move on uh, with business as usual as the negotiations take place because we have no idea what the Americans are going to do. And I don't think the Americans have any idea what they're going to do.
This is a horrible situation because it's not just the complete loss of trust. It's the loss of credibility into anything coming from the other side. And with Russia, we could at least say that we saw him trying, and we saw the US trying and shift course. I mean, it's hard to say that dispatching Witkoff was not at least meant in a way that also the Russians understood that, okay, fine, we're gonna try. But with Iran, it's a completely different story, isn't it? It's heavy-handed, and it's imposing, and it's a 60-day deadline or what or else. It's like it's a completely different mindset and frame. And of course, we see the influence of Israel on trying not only, and just on a side note, the Western media doesn't just like look away from the genocide; it legitimizes and excuses the genocide. It's even worse than that. But let's leave that one aside. But the when it comes to Iran, we have a very similar dynamic that everybody blames Iran for breaking agreements, which even just the JCPOA is evidently cancelled by the United States. And then Mike Pompeo even had the audacity to demand that Iran still live up to it because it's still valid with the French and the Germans and the others. I mean, that level of audacity just continues until now. So my question is, how does the Iranian leadership deal with that? And we know that there are factions within Iran that have different ideas of where to go. What's the internal approach at the moment that seems manageable?
Yes, there are different political parties, there are different political persuasions. Elites have differing views on where to go from here. There's a very di I would be I mean to be very blunt, the diversity of opinion that you see in Iran, both online and offline, is much greater than in the West. And that, of course, is ironic. But you're right. The West, when you say everybody, of course, you're talking about the West. The West always says Iran is the side that violates agreements, but it's always Iran that has been committed to its agreements, and it's always the West that violates its agreements. But Western media, just like they, as you rightly pointed out, justify and are apologists for genocide, they will basically cover for the U.S. and Western governments. Even if they hate Trump, they'll still cover for them when it comes to Iran or when it comes to Russia or when it comes to China or anyone else that the states or the United States or the Western states and regimes are at odds with. But I would argue that it's even, it's worse than that. When it comes to Russia, if he really tried, as you say, then he's a weak president. Then he's incapable. Trump could have ended the war in Ukraine when he first came to power. He could have just said, this is Biden's war, as he keeps saying, even though that's nonsense. He was president for 4 years and he helped uh, strengthen the Ukrainian army. He did much more to push for this confrontation than Obama did. He gave weapons. He increased the size of the Ukrainian army. I think increased four, five, six-fold during his tenure. He gave anti-tank weapons, whereas Obama didn't. So it's not as if it was just Biden's war. But let's just say it is Biden's war. But whether it is or not, he would say it's Biden's war. Now I'm not going to continue it, and I'm going to end this. It would have been over. And he had momentum, he had a mandate, and he could have done it, but he didn't. And now it's increasingly going to be difficult for him to do it if that's indeed what he wanted to do, because he's lost that momentum. Dissatisfaction is on the rise. The economy is not doing well. And one thing that I did not discuss was the trade wars. The trade wars themselves, the tariffs, he's been flip-flopping on that, and so has his people. Uh, as well. Just like over with Iran, just like with Russia, just like with everything else, they're constantly flip-flopping. This is another example. And he's been forced to back down on issues with regards to the trade war. But in any case, going back to Ukraine, he had the mandate. People knew what he was saying before the election, but he chose not to take that step. So if we are to be, if we are to take his word, then he was weak. He was unable to take the step necessary to end the war. The Russians put forward demands. He could have accepted them. He could have ended it. And now we're going to have more bloodshed because he stalled and he chose Kellogg, who is just talking. We all know what he says is unacceptable to the Russians, and the Russians have the upper hand. So it's pretty bad. But the Iranians, they will continue with business as usual. The Iranians are not going to be intimidated by the United States. The Iranian military is preparing itself for a potential conflict. The United States can't engage in war with Iran. Remember, I mean, if we talk about war, that means that the Americans will have to bring in like what, 1.5 million soldiers, which will cost them, an unbelievable amount of money. And where are they going to put them? In Iraq? Well, the Iraqis won't accept it. In Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia won't accept it. The Americans don't have that sort of money anymore to bring in these, numbers. So we're not talking about a war. The United States simply cannot invade Iran. If we're talking about airstrikes, where are the Americans going to attack Iran from? From Qatar? Qatar is a regime that's loyal to the Americans. They're helping the Americans bomb Yemen as we speak. They are helping murder the resistance in Yemen, which is supporting the people of Gaza. But if they attack Iran from Qatar, that would be the end of, the Iranians would punish them. They would be complicit. So Qatar, the Emirates, all these tiny states in the Persian Gulf region, they're not going to allow the Americans to use their airspace. Of course, even if they don't, the Iranians, in their retaliation, will strike at the Americans, whether military or other interests, anywhere they want in the Persian Gulf region. But still, they're not going to allow the Americans to use their airbase. So all the Americans can do is use Diego Garcia, assuming that Turkey doesn't do anything foolish either. Or Iraq, of course, the population of Iraq would overrun the U.S. embassy and its bases if they use Iraqi airspace. So if the Americans want to strike Iran, most probably it'd have to come from Diego Garcia. That's a 5,000-kilometer flight to the center of Iran. And those B-52s and B-2s would be extremely vulnerable. And they would have to have aircraft accompanying them from from aircraft carriers, I would assume. That would be very expensive, very risky, and the Iranian retaliation would be very easy. The Iranians have hundreds of underground bases. They could fire drones and missiles at American assets anywhere in the region. And it's not wouldn't just be military assets. It would be any U.S. interest in the region, whatever the Iranians define, they could strike. So a strike on Iran would be very costly for the Americans, but the Iranians are preparing themselves for that day.
Uh,
And of course, there's the possibility that the Israelis would attack. If they want to attack, they'd have to have American support. The Iranians would respond to that as well. Right now, the Iranians are preparing themselves for the worst, but they will continue to negotiate for two reasons. One is if the Americans are prepared to be reasonable at the negotiating table and there's a deal, that's fine. The second is that the Iranians want to show the international community that if there is a problem, it's not with us. We will negotiate, but if the Americans are, if they're unreasonable, the Iranians want the global South, the global majority, public opinion across the world to see that it's not the Iranians who walked away from the table. So negotiating is smart for these reasons. A, maybe the Americans will be reasonable. B, if they're not reasonable, we expose them to the world for being inconsistent and being aggressive and making demands that are unacceptable to any sovereign country. But at the same time, the Iranians are preparing themselves for a possible military conflict.
I'm sorry to ask you this because it makes me very, very sad. But does this include strikes at your capital and major cities? Because if we look at how the United States conducted the Iraq war, they immediately bombed civilian infrastructure like into ashes, right? And we see how, I mean, Israel currently has no limits and no constraints on its genocide in Gaza, like bombing anything for civilian infrastructure, anything. And a massive version of this on Iran would mean maybe even the use of intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? I mean, this utter total destruction scenario is that something that's going through the is it part of of what is being thought about in Iran?
There are no illusions in Iran about the barbarism of the regime in Washington. I mean, no one here reads the New York Times and the Washington Post and takes anything that they say about themselves seriously. The United States and the West in general have exposed themselves, meaning the Western political establishment, have shown themselves to be the most barbaric and backward regimes on this planet. And young Americans and young Europeans, they've turned against this political establishment because they see what they do, whether it's in Gaza, because what's happening in Gaza cannot happen without the support of the West. The Israeli regime without full support would not last more than a few weeks. All the ammunition, all the weapons, all the funding, all the aid, all the political cover comes from the West. Without that, they would just collapse tomorrow, or it would begin to collapse from tomorrow. On the other hand, as you point out, the Americans, in Iraq, they went after civilian targets. That's what they're doing in Yemen. They cannot destroy Ansar-Allah's underground bases. They failed. They admit that in the Western media. I think it was the Wall Street Journal that pointed that out. So what do? They bomb ports. They bomb civilian ports. And the Western media will be apologetic about it and say that these are Ansarullah strongholds or bases, or just like what they did in Lebanon when the Israelis were bombing civilian targets in Beirut. I was there during the war for the first week of the war, and during when Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred, I was literally, I guess, less than 1,000 meters away when they bomb high-rise apartment blocks. Western media, journalists based in Lebanon would call these Hezbollah strongholds or Hezbollah bases, even though they're cameramen, they're drivers, they're producers or almost all Lebanese. Some of them lived in these neighborhoods. They knew very well that they were just targeting civilian buildings and trying to kill ordinary people to put pressure on Hezbollah. That's what they're doing in Yemen. We all know this, but Western media will lie. They will, they're doing, they'll remember at the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, how when they bombed the hospital and the Western media tried to pin the blame on the resistance and say that hundreds of people were killed in an attack. And they said one of their rockets was misfired. We all know that a small rocket cannot bring down a hospital and can't kill, or parts of a hospital and kill hundreds of people. But the Western media would lie because they wanted to help the Israeli regime. Uh, but then later we saw them literally destroy all the hospitals. They kill all those kids in incubators. They left them there to die. But now it's all normalized. So the Western media has been exposed. Everyone in the West, the elites have been exposed. Most importantly, they've been exposed to young Europeans and Americans who are heroically protesting, Jews, Christians, Muslims, others, people from all walks of life. They see the reality. So yes, the Iranians are preparing themselves for the worst. They are preparing themselves for aggression. But the difference is that Iran is very, very powerful. It's been preparing itself for 2 decades. It has underground bases across the country. And especially over the past few months, the Iranians have been upgrading their missiles and drones and anti-aircraft capabilities and anti-missile capabilities, so that when the time comes, or if the time comes, they will be able to hit very hard and very accurately. And hopefully it won't come to that. But never trust the US government, never trust the Israeli regime, and never trust any NATO regime, whether it's uh, Erdogan, who helped the United States with Operation Timber Sycamore, and Qatar, which is a neighbor, or whether it's Norway and Canada. Uh, the fact is that NATO and its regional allies, they will do anything.
How does the new relationship, the security treaty with Russia, impact Iran's calculations? And the fact also that is now Steve Witkoff who was put in charge of both, right, the negotiations with Russia and with Iran. I personally think that this is, I mean, also from the US side, this is strategic calculation on a diplomatic level. Do you also see that, and how do you evaluate the new relationship?
Well, the very fact that the Persian media that is owned by the West, and there are tens of television channels, thousands of online media entities, uh, and literally armies of online armies working from Albania and elsewhere, uh, that are trying to disrupt the Iranian-Russian relationship, shows that the West is very concerned about the growing Iranian-Russian relationship. But it's not just Iran and Russia; it is Iran and China, especially after Trump came back to power and began the trade war. The relationship between Iran and China which has always been growing. It's growing much faster. So the proxy war in Ukraine, the trade war with China, which began under the first Trump regime, all of these have acted as catalysts to push forward the relationship between Iran, Russia, and China at a very rapid pace. So, and that relationship, of course, is military. It has a strong military component to it, but it is comprehensive. It is economic. It is cultural. The economic, I think, aspect to it is probably the most important. Of course, we've heard of the North-South transport corridor. That will be key to the future relationship between Iran and Russia. It will make it much easier for Russia to trade without having anything to do with NATO, without having anything to do with the Mediterranean. They can trade from the Persian Gulf or the Indian Ocean to Africa, with the subcontinent, with the South Asia, and with Russia, with China. with southern ports of China. It could perhaps be less expensive for parts of Russia to deal with China through Iran. Uh, it depends on the calculations made by companies. So um, the Iranian-Russian relationship after Ukraine has changed completely. And the Iranian-Chinese relationship has changed dramatically too. It's very interesting, and although your question was about Russia, but China is known to be very slow to make changes. Its changes are usually very slow. Some people compare China to a super tanker that wants it when it wants to turn around. It's very slow. But what Trump has succeeded in doing is that he's made a dramatic change in the decision-making process in Beijing. And the relationship between Iran and China, which has always been growing and has been improving, it's the Chinese have always been cautious because of U.S. sanctions, because of the threats made by the United States. The same was true with Russia as well before the proxy war in Ukraine. But after Russia was sanctioned, the relationship with Iran evolved dramatically. And it was Russia that was seeking Iran even more than the Iranians were seeking Russia, uh, improve relations with Russia. And now the situation with China has evolved dramatically as well. The Chinese see that the Americans are behaving aggressively and waging war of sorts. So they are putting aside that caution now, which is very good for Iran. So Iran's relations with the global South, Russia, China, India, but BRICS countries, global South countries in general, the global majority in general, have been improving rapidly. The West has become increasingly isolated, especially after the trade war and after Trump came to power. So this is very good for Iran. And as I'm sure you've seen, the Saudi defense minister, the son of the king and the, of course, brother of the uh, probably to be king, the crown prince, he traveled to Iran, brought a message from the king, met Ayatollah Khamenei, and that I think was very significant. So it shows that in general, the United States, because of the proxy war in Ukraine, because of the trade war and the tariff war, but also because of the genocide that it is pursuing, its image has been destroyed, its credibility has been destroyed. Western military capabilities are not like they used to be, and its behavior at the negotiating table over tariffs. All of these have made it the position of the United States across the world and the West in general, and of course the Israelis, it has been severely weakened, and Iran's position has been much strengthened. It's not Iran that's isolated. So Iran has very excellent relations with powerful countries, regional countries, neighboring countries, and the United States has problems that it did not have 10 years ago in 2015 when the JCPOA was signed.
Yeah. So, in a way, the last 10 years actually strengthened the hand of Iran. I absolutely agree. But one of the things that the US or the
But
West
sorry for
is,
interrupting. But if you read Western media and if you listen to Western think tanks, Iran is on the ropes, Iran is weakened, Iran is. But if you look at the facts on the ground, if you look at the bigger picture, if you look at the trade war, if you look at Ukraine, if you look at the genocide, it's obvious that it's Iran that's in a stronger position, not the West. But Western media, Western think tanks, they are in this bubble, this exceptionalism and Eurocentrism governs the way in which they think, and they can't really deal with reality. So they seem to think that this is the old world where they were the center of the universe and that they could that they are in a commanding position. But in reality, anyone who steps out of that bubble sees that the world today is very different from what it was a decade ago.
yeah, it's also some form of very strange mass psychological issue where there's this constant need of speaking out of both sides of your mouth. Because on the one hand, Iran is the greatest threat to security the globe has ever seen. and would devour Israel tomorrow if it wasn't for the United States. On the other hand, Iran is so weak that it will collapse in 2 days, right? You need both of these things to be true at the same time in order to justify these
Exactly.
warmonger policies. But
Exactly.
I just want
And
to
it's
ask
not just Iran, by the way. Do you see the same
Russia, China.
paradox with China, with Russia? The Russians are cannibalizing, I don't know, washing machines to take out chips, and they're desperate. But on the other hand, they're going to take over Europe and they're going to conquer Europe. The Chinese, they need a deal. They're desperate, they're falling apart. Their economy cannot last. But the Chinese, we don't push them back. They're going to take over everything.
But
In the case of China, it's a bit different actually, only because Trump's opponents want to make him look uh, they want to point out that he's failed in the trade war. But still, the paradox with China exists. But they're sort of the opponents of Trump on the one hand want to bash him, but on the other hand, they don't want to make China look strong either. So they're in a sort of very difficult position nowadays. But still, that paradox exists.
But that's why like Western mass media is completely utterly useless in order to understand what's really happening on the ground. The question I have, and maybe that's the final one, is what kind of infrastructure, global infrastructure, is Iran most trying to help develop? Because you were especially suffering under these banking sanctions, because just outside banks, including Chinese banks and so on, wouldn't touch Iran because they will come under secondary sanctions, right? And that was a very, very effective, evil tool to use. But so an alternative banking system is certainly one of the global infrastructures that is needed. What are the other ones that Iran, from experience, can say that's what we need?
Well, I think in the past, again, going back a decade, this was a very difficult question for the Iranians because Iran was the only major power that was sanctioned, and which was, I mean, there were other countries too, like Venezuela, Cuba,
Cuba.
Syria, Nicaragua, well, Venezuela, Cuba mostly, and other countries in this region, Afghanistan, Iraq still, the Americans are controlling Iraqi finances.
Yeah.
It's amazing, how
Iraqi
they
oil.
won't let go, even though Saddam is dead and long gone, and the Iraqi government is friendly to the United States, but the Americans are holding on to the money of Iraq. It's amazing how empires behave and how the Western media will say nothing about it. But now, after the war in Ukraine, that's changed. And now that Russia's been at it, and now, especially after the trade war with China and the aggressive behavior of the United States, the Chinese are looking for ways to protect themselves. The Russians, of course, like the Iranians, are looking ways to circumvent Western financial institutions and the US dollar. So the balance of power has shifted, and of course, major powers are looking for a way out. Now, there is BRICS, of course, as I'm sure you've discussed on your show many times, which is all, these are all good. BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But at the end of the day, Iran is not going to wait for BRICS, and neither is Russia nor China, because countries like India, they are they're not strong when it comes to standing up to the United States. Countries like Brazil, they are very vulnerable to the United States. So BRICS has its difficulties. And so Iran will pursue BRICS, of course. Iran is now a member, just like it's a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But Iran and China, Iran, Russia, Iran and neighboring countries, other powers will be pursuing different means to make the sanctions regime imposed by the United States less effective. And we are moving in that direction. After all, the United States today has much less control over what Iran does with its oil than it had and than it did a decade ago. The last 3 years under the late President Raisi, Iran was able to expand its oil production and sell its oil, and it's doing so today, even though Trump has imposed secondary sanctions on Iran. But Iran is selling its oil and other goods. So obviously, the Iranians are finding solutions, and so are the Russians, and so are the Chinese, and so are other countries, although they may not be bragging about it. And I think that as we move forward, and as the United States continues to behave unreasonably, and as the United States economy is heading towards greater difficulty, And as the West is becoming increasingly divided in different ways, it is going to become increasingly popular for countries in the global South, the global majority, to use mechanisms of trade that are not vulnerable to the United States. So I am optimistic about the future, especially since the technology has changed things. Uh, Blockchain technology, AI, all the different technologies that exist today and which are being developed, I think will change the nature of global trade very rapidly. And Western financial institutions, with or without sanctions, are becoming increasingly they will ultimately many are saying they're going to become obsolete. Even Trump Jr., I think just a couple of days ago, was saying Western banks will become obsolete in the years ahead if they don't change dramatically. So I'm optimistic that with the new technologies and with the shifting balance of power across the globe, and with the incentive that countries that are being targeted by the United States, which are now almost they include everyone, including the Canadians and the Europeans and the Mexicans. With all these changes, the United States has basically been the greatest catalyst to moving the world away from the US dollar and financial institutions controlled by the United States. And so it may take some time to get where we want to get, but it seems that we're moving in that direction and we already see signs of success.
Yes, that's why the most important thing is to avoid a war because those things are devastating. I hope things remain stable, and I thank you very much for your time. Professor Marandi, if people want to read from you, should they go to a particular page where you publish things?
Not really. I mean, I used to have a Facebook account. The free world deleted that for me, and I had an Instagram account, and the civilized world deleted that too. Now I have just my Twitter account, which is shadow banned without a doubt, but that's what I have for the time being.
I'll put that one into the links below. And everybody, Professor Marandi is luckily on a lot of channels, and we thank you very much for your analysis. Thank you, Professor Marandi.
And I thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure, and I hope you and your audience all do very well.
Likewise. See you next time.